Good evening. This is Dan Zapansky, your host for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. BTK, which stands for bind, torture, kill, was the name a sadistic sexual serial killer chose for himself as he terrorized Wichita, Kansas, starting in 1974. For over 30 years, the psychopathic killer evaded capture while he taunted police and victims' families. When finally arrested, the man responsible turned out to be Dennis Rader, the president of his church, a Boy Scout troop leader, a husband and father of two, a respected member of his community. However, he had an incredible and deadly secret. He needed to bind, torture, and kill. My guest this evening is Stephen Singular, author of Unholy Messenger, The Life and Crimes of the BTK Serial Killer. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Stephen Singular.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. It's an incredible book that we're going to be discussing today, Unholy Messenger, Life and Crimes of the BTK Serial Killer. Now, first question that always is a personal favorite of mine because I'd like to really know why, is why did you decide to write a book about BTK? What compelled you about this story? Give us a little bit of the interesting story behind that, please.
Well, I've written a number of true crime books to begin with. Secondly, so I have a history of this going back to about 1985. And secondly, I'm from a small town in Kansas, which is where Dennis Rader came from. He was from a small town outside of Wichita called Park City. I grew up 2 or 3 hours north of that, near the towns of Topeka and Kansas City for people in the States. And my town was about 900 people. That's sort of the backdrop of it. For anyone who grew up in Kansas when I did, I was born in 1950. And in 1959, the most shocking crime in Kansas history occurred, the famous, infamous, in cold blood murder case out in western Kansas, written by Truman Capote and made famous by at least 3 movies, as far as I know, maybe more. So I read it when I was in high school. I was fascinated by it. There was reason to believe that certain overtones from that crime may have filtered in, even into Dennis Rader's consciousness. As he became a serial killer, he was certainly aware of the case. Perry Smith stole a radio from the Clutter household right before he killed 4 people in that house that night. That would be 2 parents and 2 kids. Rader's first crime was the murder of the Otero family, in which he killed 2 parents and 2 children, and he stole a radio right after doing it. So there have been some very famous crimes that have come out of Kansas. So being a native of the place, I've always been interested in crimes that are generated from Kansas. Now, beyond all that, Rader confessed actually in February of 2005. I went home to see my family about 3 months later in this small town in Kansas, and my son wanted to go play basketball at this place. I took him down there. My old basketball coach was in the gym. He came up to me just and said, what are you up to? And I said, well, I'm kind of looking for a book to write. He said, you've got to write about the BTK case. And I said, well, a book had been written about it that had come out called Nightmare in Wichita. But it was really about everything that led up to the arrest of Dennis Rader, and the author who wrote it didn't know, who BTK was. It was just sort of the whole history of the case.
Right.
Anyway, the coach said, you've got to write about this. And I said, well, there's a book out there. He said, but not really about Dennis Rader, not really about who committed these crimes. And I said, I'll think about it. He said, my son-in-law was on the task force that investigated BTK for a year after he surfaced in 2004. And he was one of those who arrested Dennis Rader. You really need to talk to him and write about this. And I said, well, I'll give it some thought. He pulled out his cell phone. He dialed his number. And, 5 minutes after walking into the gym, I was talking to one of the people who arrested BTK and who had been on this very thorough, very tough investigation for an entire year leading up to the arrest. So in nonfiction, of course, the most important thing is finding people who will talk to you. I mean, it's a much harder challenge than many people realize because most police will never talk, most lawyers will never talk. But I sort of had an inside track with this guy who grew up in the same town I did. So I drove the next morning down to Wichita. I met with him, got a lot of great information, and then I met with another person who becomes a major figure in the book, who was Dennis Rader's minister of the church of which Dennis Rader was the president of the congregation. And what you find in these true crime books, what I've always found is that once there's a huge arrest or something like this, the media rushes in and does a lot of stories, and it's on national television, and there's a lot of heat generated by the whole thing. And so the people who are involved in that are asking to be interviewed. They get burnt out, and that there's a cycle that runs through this. Maybe it's 3 or 4 weeks, and then they don't want to do any more interviews, and the media goes away, and they move on to another story.
Right.
There's a certain time where if you come in after that and you get a hold of the right people, and they haven't really been interviewed in depth, they've just sort of had the surface scratched on their own stories or their own involvement in a high-profile case like this, they're really ready to talk. And the minister in Rader's church was a perfect example of this. It was 3 months after the arrest. He was going through his own crisis of faith and belief system because of the shocking fact that the man that he relied on to help his congregation and himself more than anyone else had killed at least 10 people, and it had absolutely blown a hole in his view of reality, his view of the nature of evil, and his view of how he thought, that he could read people pretty well. Well, this told him that absolutely none of those things was true. So he was really ready to talk, Pastor Michael Clark, and I talked to him that same day. I went down there that first day. So within 24 hours of really entering this gymnasium, I was speaking to an insider on the BTK task force and the minister, who again became a kind of parallel track running through the book. You have Dennis Rader and you have Pastor Clark, and I tried to sort of compare and contrast the two through the course of the narrative. So all of these elements really just came together, as they have to in these kinds of situations where, one, you have an interest in the subject, you have access to the right people. Those people are really willing to open up to you, sometimes without using their names, as in the case of the policeman, but he was still willing to share a lot of information. So it was a lot of good things that happened at the right time to sort of open the doors to let me do this. And then when I read the other book, Nightmare in Wichita, I realized that it didn't really, tell this story. It's a great, backup book that gives you the whole 20 or 30 years leading up to this. But this story really takes off when Rader is arrested. So.
Yeah, this is much more complete, and you do have incredible access, like you say. Now, let's go back to the very beginning of this, and the very subject of the story is Dennis Rader. If you could, give us just basically his early life. What was his life growing up? What was he really like?
The interesting part of this, and again, it just ties into the whole book publishing process here, but nobody remembered anything very distinctive about Dennis Rader. I mean, that all the newspaper people and others went back after he was identified as BTK and went to his high school classmates. And the people in this very small town where you kind of assume that everybody knows everybody, and really he was a nondescript character, but he had this incredible inner life that he just lived out entirely on his own. He didn't talk to his brothers. He didn't talk to his parents, he didn't talk to his friends, he didn't talk to anybody. And it involved, as in the case of some other famous serial killers, it involved killing animals when he was quite small. He saw some pictures in magazines that were prominent in the 1950s of where they were sort of images of women, someone maybe torturing them or about to torture them, or to tie them up, or to do things like this, these detective magazines, and it stimulated him in ways that I'm sure were very perplexing to him, but there was a stimulation attached to it. Also, when his mother would spank him, she was a disciplinarian in the family, and that's maybe significant in the fact that most of the people he killed and all of the people he intended to kill were women. But she used to spank him, and it would sexually arouse him, or that's what he said later on. So very early on, he began making his own little drawings of female figures, and he would draw lines on them as if they were being tied up by black tape or something of that nature. And he just developed a fetish with doing this. And it grew more elaborate as he grew older, and again, this is something that absolutely nobody else knew about. So the way I write about it in the book is that, he sort of divided into two people when he was very young. There was he was the oldest son in the family. It was very important to him to please his parents. He always referred to one of his younger brothers as he's the black sheep of the family. Dennis was the good boy. Dennis was the very trustworthy child that got things done. So he divided really almost into two people at a very early age, and he kept this one very, very secret when he was killing animals, when he was making these drawings, when he was having these sexual fantasies, when he was looking at these magazines. And then the other boy was the public figure that, everybody thought was very normal. And of course, this pattern runs right through his life, as we said earlier, where he grows into BTK, yet he's the president of the church and the Cub Scout leader and all of that. So when I wrote the book, the information that was available to me and that came out in court, where he stood up and confessed to the entire world that he killed 10 people, and he spoke to the police on videotape for 32 hours straight outlining his crimes. And so you looked at it and you said, well, gee, this guy has told us everything about him there is to know. So I wrote the book in 2005. It came out in April of 2006. And 4 or 5 days after it came out, I was on CNN, and they did an hour on this case and really on the book. And people who knew something about this guy or this case started writing my website and started sending in emails, and some were pretty interesting, but by far and away the most interesting one was from a guy in Wichita who was gay and who as a young man had been a part of this scene in downtown Wichita at a bus station where there was a lot of gay activity. And when Rader was arrested, they dug up all these pictures of what he looked like when he was 18, 19, 20. And when this guy saw his picture, he was just completely shocked because, according to him, Rader was an active participant in all of this activity, and he was, came down there quite often. And one night, he and the gentleman who contacted me had gone out on a date, and they went back to somebody's house, and Rader, just totally out of the blue, tied the guy up. He was an expert at knot tying, hit him over the head, cut open his head, just scared the daylights out of this guy, and then took off and disappeared. But the point of the story being that he had apparently told everybody who he was, and nobody knew any of this until, at least I didn't know any of this, and I'm not aware of anybody else who did until this man came forward again anonymously and told me all these stories. So there were, I think if you dig deeper into the story, you find all of this shame and all of this conflict based around his sexual identity, because what the man who contacted me told me that he would engage in homosexual activity, but he would say, I'm not gay, I don't like gay people, all this sort of thing. And the man who contacted me said he was just totally and completely conflicted about it. And if you follow the Rader story through his life, he keeps doing things in order to sort of become normal, or become a normal person, at least as he defined that term. And he ends up following his father's footsteps in almost every aspect of his life. He goes into the military. His father had been in the military. He comes back to the small town. He marries a girl he knew in high school, thinking, if I just get married, these demons will leave me alone and I'll be all right. Then if they have children, well, that'll clear up the problem. Then if we join the church, religion will take care of it. And of course, nothing dealt in any way, shape, or form with who he actually was and what he was actually struggling with inside of himself. So it was fascinating to me that a man who confesses like this to the whole world apparently was still leaving out huge portions of his story, and they all had to do with his conflicted sexual identity.
Now, we've talked a little bit about Dennis Rader in his adult life. You say he followed in his father's footsteps. He joined the military, I believe in the Air Force, and he's a Boy Scout troop leader. and he's a father of two. And how old is he at the time that the first murders, the Oteros, in 1974, how old is he at that time, and what is it that happened previous to this? What happened in his life that may have been a triggering effect or had some bearing on the crimes themselves? What was going on in his life in 1974?
He's 30 years old at that point. And again, he's taken all of these steps in order to, so-called make himself normal. None of it has worked. And whereas he used to make drawings of women tied up or kill a small animal, he just found that he needed to bring this more and more to life. So he made several attempts to sort of ensnare women or trap women, but none of those plans really worked out earlier. Then he lost his job right before these murders happened. He didn't have any work. I mean, as one of the psychologists in the book says, men are very vulnerable when they're not working. He had all this time. He began sort of driving up and down the streets looking for attractive women. He had a whole system that he would eventually put together. He called that trolling, where he would look for somebody to sort of target. He picked out a woman and her young daughter, Julie Otero and Josephine, her young daughter, and he decided, and then he carried this into the next stage, which he called stalking. And then, he basically had his target identification, and then he would give his so-called project a name. He called this first project, Little Mex, based upon the young girl that he was seeing with her mother. So I think it was just the absolute inability to, confront anything of what he actually was or what he was actually dealing with, and it would just build up, and then it would need some release in some form. And I think the tension and the pressure got worse and worse. So anyway, he settled in on these two people, and he had their schedule figured out, and he thought, well, they're going to be home alone at a certain time in the morning, and he would be able to go into the house and do what he wanted to do. But as in many of his crimes, when he miscalculated virtually everything, and when he got inside the house, the husband was home, and a young boy was also there, so there were 4 people instead of 2. 2 of them were males. All of them were trained in self-defense. There was a dog on the premises, and one of the mysteries of the whole BTK saga in Wichita was that if he had acted alone, nobody could figure out how he could have gotten into the house, subdued 4 people, and ended up strangling them and actually torturing in some ways, and how he could have actually done this without an accomplice. So it wasn't until he actually confessed to these crimes 31 years later that you got a picture of that. But what actually happened in that case is that they basically just submitted to him. He repeatedly went into houses. He had a gun, and he said, I'm from California, I'm on the lam, I just need some money from you and maybe your car, and then I'll leave you alone. And so these people actually agreed to be tied up one by one, and then, of course, once they were tied up, he proceeded to go ahead and kill them. So, I mean, if there's any moral in the story, it's that, don't allow anybody to do that to you, because it's just, looking back, it just seems amazing that people would have actually, given into that. But he was the first killer of that kind ever, I think, in the history of Wichita, and nobody thought anybody would do anything like this. So he got basically a taste for killing, I think, and sort of really fully enacting out his fantasies. And then, of course, the same thing happened that had always happened. The urges would come back, and they would come back very strongly. And so he would go through the process again, trolling, stalking, picking a target, giving it a name. And this continued on for a number of years as he killed 7 people fairly quickly, the four Oteros, and then a woman named Catherine Bright, a woman in 74, a woman named Shirley Vienne in 77, and a woman named Nancy Fox in December of 1977. And then he stopped for a while, as far as we know. And then he began again. To go back, if I could, for a minute, to the story I told a little bit earlier about the the gay man who contacted me after my appearance on CNN, he believed, and people in his circle believed, that Rader had actually or possibly killed somebody before these crimes that are known about. And this goes back into the 1960s, when a gay man in their circle had been stabbed 40 times. And the police had actually taken the man who contacted me into their confidence and given him certain details because he thought maybe he could gather information off the street because he was in that circle. One of the things that the police told him was that the killer had left a dime on the hip of the nude body of the victim who had been stabbed 40 times. And according to this man, Rader had gone around and told people that he had actually, deposited a dime on this guy, on the victim, because his life wasn't worth a dime, or was only worth a dime, or something like that. The significance of that is that, number one, BTK may have killed more people than we know about. Number two, that may have been his first crime. If it was, in fact, something he'd done, then he had killed at a time when Kansas had the death penalty, and that was significant because Kansas did not have the death penalty from 1974, I believe, until 1991. And all of his crimes appeared to have occurred in that period, and that's why he was not given the death penalty. It was not a capital case. But again, there are lots of unanswered questions that still remain. Again, as I said, for somebody who confessed for 32 hours, I don't think he told us everything.
Now, let's go back just a little bit. I wanted to, one of the more interesting parts of the story was that after the Otero murders, some other people came forward and confessed to these murders eventually. There seemed to be some mental health issues, but the police certainly did not attribute those crimes to the BTK. And that was a feature of this as well in his narcissistic behavior, is that if he didn't get recognition for those crimes, it later became an issue when in the communications with media and the authorities.
Right. What happened was that the Oteros were killed, and then, as you said, several people who were not connected to the case came forward and took credit for it, which sometimes happens, and there were mental health issues. And this really aggravated Rader because he was sitting there saying, I did this, and I want some credit for it, but of course I don't want to get caught. So he began this pattern of communication with the authorities starting in 1974, not long after the Oteros were killed. And the Wichita police basically made a decision that they didn't want to inform the public that there might be a serial killer in their community because they thought, well, if he wants this much attention, if we give him attention, he's going to kill again. So they made a conscious decision not to do that, but in reality, he did keep killing, and he did send in certain communications. And this becomes very important, later on in the story when he basically decides to reestablish communication with the authorities. I mean, he apparently stopped killing in about 1991. That was, I think, the last time that there was a known victim. And so he didn't do anything for the next 13 years as far as we know. Again, that 1991 is significant because that's when Kansas reinstated the death penalty, and he followed all these things very closely. He knew all about DNA testing. He bought books on serial killers that had chapters about him in it. He would sit home at night and read this, and of course nobody knew who he was, but he had stashed inside of his house mementos and writings and drawings and newspaper clippings from what he had done. He had a series of photographs that were absolutely incredible, taken of himself, where he had been tied up in bondage positions. He learned how to take photographs from a distance of himself. He would dig a grave, wrap himself in plastic, get down in the grave, take a picture of that. He took pictures in his parents' basement of basically mock suicide. And so you had this incredibly conservative man. On the outside, he was a Republican, believed in law and order, didn't want to live in Wichita because there was too much crime, church-going, etc. Guy who was taking the most outlandish photographs I've ever seen of anything like this.
Sure.
So he claimed there were two people, inside of him. I never quite bought into that. But there was certainly an incredibly, repressed other person who needed to come out in some very strange ways.
Sure. If you could, let me just read this correspondence. I think this is the first correspondence with police, but it's very telling. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the information you learned from the task force, especially in reaction to this first letter. Like you say, this is a very unique serial killer, even compared to all the notorious serial killers.
Yeah.
Let me read this correspondence. I'm sorry this happened to society. They are the ones who suffer the most. It's hard to control myself. You probably call me psychotic with sexual perversion hang-up. When this monster entered my brain, I will never know. But it's here to stay. How does one cure himself? If you ask for help, that you have killed 4 people, they will laugh or hit the panic button, call the cops. I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurt me as well as society. Society can be thankful that there are ways for people like me to relieve myself at time by daydreams of some victims being tortured and being mine. It's a bit complicated game, my friend, of the monster play, putting victims number down, following them, checking up on them, waiting in the dark, waiting. The pressure is great, and sometimes he runs the game to his liking. Maybe you can stop him. I can't. He's already chosen his next victim or victims. I don't know who they are yet. The next day after I read the paper, I will know. But it's too late. Good luck hunting. Yours truly, guiltily. P.S. Since sex criminals do not change their M.O., or by nature cannot do so, I will not change my M.O. And the code words will be for me: bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. You see, he's at it again. They will be on the next victim. What was the reaction from the task force when they received that? Did they immediately call the FBI at that time?
Well, now this goes back to 1974. I mean, this actually came in right after the Otero murders.
Right.
So there was another, task force 30 years later, and they tried, the Wichita Police Department in the immediate aftermath of this tried to reach out to him by putting an ad in the local paper, or by putting a notice in the paper and asking him to call them and establish some sort of communication, and nothing ever came from it. So the interesting part of this, among other things, was that the original question, was why did you get involved in this subject? Well, I'm a little bit younger than Dennis Rader, but I grew up in this small town in Kansas, and I know something about the pervasive religion there, the sexual repression, and all of those things, and the difficulty of maybe kids who have, at least back when I was young, had an interest in artistic things. Here was a guy who I think was quite interested in artistic things. He wanted to write. He wanted to draw. He was pretty good at drawing. And he used these crimes to make some form of artistic expression, which I thought was an important part of the story. He didn't just want to kill people. He wanted to write about it, and he wanted to write a book about it. And all of this factors in later in why he started reestablishing communications with the police, because there was somebody writing a book about him in Wichita named Robert Beatty. I referred to that book earlier. Sure. And an article came out in the Wichita Eagle. Now, what you just read was written in 1974. As far as we know, he killed 10 people between 1974 and 1991. Then he stopped. Then in January of 2004, when he's about to turn 60, there's a big article in the Wichita Eagle on a Sunday morning that just says, whatever happened to BTK? And he reads about this, and it stimulates him. And he realizes this guy is writing a book, and he thinks, well, nobody can write a book about me because nobody knows who I am or what I've lived through. I need to write my own book. Sure. I mean, that's a very strange mentality, I think, for a serial killer. So he decides to start playing a game again with the police at that point. Now, I mean, it's fascinating to me that, you know, he's about 60, he's gotten away with all these crimes. The police have never come close to identifying him or figuring out that he doesn't live in Wichita. With all of their profilers, all of their expertise, they have absolutely no clue who BTK is, and most of them think he's probably dead by now. But he has this impulse to communicate and to write his story and to give it some artistic expression and to make drawings of things. And to me, it was just very interesting because I grew up in a culture where a lot of that stuff was repressed, and so did he. And these two things are bound together in him. You know, you do a violent act and then you make some expression of it. So anyway, he starts communicating at that point in March 2004. He makes his first communication with the police in many, many years. And he sends in a souvenir or a visual object from one of these crimes that was committed in the 1980s. And so the police know it's him. Nobody else but him. He took pictures of this woman named Vicki Wegerle in bondage positions after she was dead, and only the killer could have had those. So he has this profound desire, as you alluded to earlier, to be sort of recognized for what he's done as he's getting older, and to have a communication with someone. So, you know, of all people, he picks out the Wichita Police Department. So, I mean, he could have just, you know, walked into the sunset, gotten away with all this. He initially said what he was going to do was put all of his belongings around the crimes in a safe, and then when he was dead, people would open it up and they would realize that he had been BTK. But he starts in a whole other story of communication. And as the story unfolds, of course, he eventually gets caught because of that. But I just found this mixture in him of extreme violence and cruelty combined with the need to express himself artistically and to make a record of what he'd done very, very interesting.
Now,
combined with sexual sadism. Well, we don't want to leave that out.
Certainly. Now, you do quite a few interviews with Pastor Clark from the Christ Lutheran Church. What information did you got a lot of information from him. What was the most profound bit of information that you got from him surrounding this case? Well,
I think several things about it really, really struck me. And there's a reason that Pastor Clark becomes a main figure in the book. I mean, as I said earlier, you know, we all like to think we're pretty sharp, we're pretty bright, we know how to judge character, we know who people are. We like to tell ourselves that because it makes us feel safe. And here was the minister of this church who thought he had a pretty good grasp on things. And when he learned that the man he relied on the most, the man he trusted the most in the entire church, was not only a serial killer and had not only terrorized the community for years and years, but had taken one of his aging victims from 1985, I think a woman who was in her 60s. He had killed her one Saturday night when he was supposed to be at a Cub Scout gathering. You know, he's supposed to be off doing his social duty with the Cub Scouts, but he slips away, gets the woman, kills her, takes her inside the sanctuary of the church when she's dead, poses her in bondage positions, and takes a series of photographs. Again, I come back to the need for some sort of artistic expression, however twisted, after he's committed his crimes, and creates these images of her. And so if you were, you know, trying to explode someone's view of reality or what they think is reality, this pretty much did it for Pastor Clark, that inside of his church, his sacred place, these activities had gone on. So what drew me to him was that he was a man who had lived a very difficult life. He had had a lot of problems and very hard challenges to go through. And he had sort of worked through some sort of emotional, spiritual process to deal with the tragedies in his life and come to grip with them. And as he said, you know, keep his relationship with God intact. And on the other hand, you have a man who was, you know, faced with some very, very serious and difficult challenges in life as well. And he blame them on demons, and he never sought any sort of help, or he never talked about it with anybody. He never did anything except to sort of shove it down inside of him and say, I can be normal, I will be normal, except when I'm going to go out and kill somebody. And then after I've done that, I'm going to be a very normal, good citizen of Wichita, Kansas. And I thought the contrast between the two men was, they're the same age, similar backgrounds. One had sort of confronted the deepest pain in his life and come out the other side of it and done good for people, including Dennis Rader after he was arrested. The other one had said, I can deny my sexuality, I can deny all these things, and I'll be okay. And the result was one tragedy right after another. And to me, that's a pretty strong object lesson.
What did Pastor Clark, in the end, attribute those unspeakable crimes to? What did he think?
He was... like I said, this bent his mind so badly to think that this president of his congregation could do these things that he began to look into the study of demons, basically, and he began to look into demonic possession. And he talked to people who had expertise in that area. He interviewed people. He read a lot about it, and I think for him, there are sort of three interpretations of what Dennis Rader, who he was and what he did, and I laid out all three in the book, so a reader can take their choice. There's the psychological interpretation delivered by a psychiatrist in Wichita saying, here's just a person who denied who he was, couldn't deal with his inner life, and tragedy resulted. Another woman presents the point of view that which some people believe that a lot of criminal behavior is based upon brain chemistry, and that the brains of people like Dennis Rader are not the same brains that you and I have, and that there are organic reasons for why some of this behavior occurs. He's never been studied, so we don't know if that's true or not. Pastor Clark went the third direction, which is that there is such a thing as demonic possession. And it can drive these behaviors. Rader's only explanation that he ever gave of any kind really was to say that he was possessed by something that he called Rex, which was the name he gave the demon that took over and caused him to commit these crimes. He even had a visual image, again an artistic image that he created of this demon, which actually was a kind of a nasty, demented looking frog. And I communicated with him after his arrest. He wrote me some letters, and he would draw pictures of frogs on the pieces of paper, so he still had this desire to express himself in drawing. You can pick and choose what you want to believe about it. I tend to go with the psychological explanation that because when he eventually confessed and he eventually stood up in court and talked about all this, and then he was sentenced. And at his sentencing hearing, they brought out these incredible photographs that I referred to earlier of him, where he had just, for another example, he had gone out in the woods in Kansas in a rural area. He had set up a series of pulleys linking a wire from one tree to the other. He would then tie himself up in bondage and swing from one tree branch to the other on this pulley. Just unimaginable stuff. And I just saw him as somebody who might have fit into some other sexual subculture somewhere, but not in rural Kansas in a tiny, Midwestern Protestant community. Sure. And if he had any capacity to, have a broader experience of life somehow. One of the things that a psychiatrist said to me that really stayed with me was that in spite of this bizarre behavior, and in spite of having masturbated at some of the crime scenes after the women were dead, he never had sex with maybe he did not have sex with any women outside of his marriage, because that might have been perceived as something that was wrong and unchristian. And that really struck me, because I think there may have been some truth in it. So, what an incredible psychology that could encompass all of these various parts.
Now, you talked about the 32-hour confession, and the contents included all kinds of things, but the incredible details surrounding the murders, were those details given by BTK in that 32-hour confession?
Yeah, he was a huge detail man. I mean, he was big on details in his work. He kept copious records of what he had done. If you look at the communication that he sent into the police after the Otero murders, the very first thing he sent in, it was a detailed description of how the bodies were laid on the bed. The head was pointing one direction, the feet the other, the arms were bound one way. So he had written down over the years precise descriptions of everything he'd done. And so when he called it up for the police, I mean, I don't think he had the written records in front of him, but he had an incredible capacity to recall all this because all the details were very fresh. So.
Yeah, and the details included things I thought were just incredible as well, that he said he pulled up a chair to watch the boy die, that he couldn't strangle the girl. This is the very first murder, according to him.
Yeah.
And he couldn't strangle her, so he hung her in the basement, and obviously reveled in recounting every one of those details as well in that 32-hour confession.
Right, and then he hung the girl in the basement, which is, of course, horrific, and horrific enough, but then he would go back to his parents' home and reenact the crime on himself. He tied a rope from a sewer pipe or a water pipe or something in the basement, looped it around his neck, was naked, and set up a remote camera, and then reenacted what essentially was his own death. And, I mean, another psychiatrist said to me, he said, normally you find in these kinds of people, they have one or two fetishes or one or two, areas of sexual interest. He said he had them all. He had everything.
Sure.
And apparently, based upon the information that came in later, it was heterosexual, homosexual, children, everything.
Now let's talk a little bit about how he did get tripped up and how he actually did get caught, because it is an incredible story for a person that has evaded capture for 30 years, how he finally does get caught.
Right. He had an identification throughout his life with people in law enforcement. I mean, he thought about maybe becoming a police officer. He admired the police. Again, as I said, he was a law and order Republican. And so the strategy, when he began starting up his communications again in 2004 on the part of the Wichita Police Department with the input of the FBI, was every time you make a public statement, it was Lieutenant Landwehr who was running the investigation and made the public statements, devote some of your time as if you're talking directly to BTK, not just to the public, but try and establish some sort of connection. And for a long time, it didn't seem to be working. But over time, it did. It did sort of connect with the guy. And he thought a lot about Lieutenant Landwehr. And then as he sent in about a dozen communications to the police, he ultimately sent in a question saying, if I send you something on a diskette, a little floppy disk for a computer, would you be able to trace that back? And he actually believed that the police would tell him the truth about that. Wow. Because he had sort of established a bond, at least in his own mind, with the authorities.
Right.
And so he had used this diskette once at the church to copy some church-related materials. And, of course, he asked the police, could you trace anything on this? And they said, oh, no, obviously not. And he trusted them, and he sent it in. And when the police got their hands on it, they thought, well, this is going to be an incredibly extensive search, and computer searches can be difficult with hidden information and all of that. But they have special software for that, so they thought they'd have to bring in all of that, and they clicked it on, and within about 30 seconds, they figured out, that he was named Dennis, he was at the church, he was the president, and the case was solved essentially, within a handful of minutes once he did that. But I think the important point of that was that as he got older, he had a profound need to communicate who he really was with somebody. To say, this is who I am, this is what I did, I want some credit for it, and I want to bond with somebody, some living human being. The only people he ever said to, I'm BTK, were the people he was killing. He would say it to them, and then they were dead, so that was out. But so the person he chooses to sort of bond with is the head of the homicide division in the Wichita Police Department. And when the day he was arrested, a few days after that, once they were able to obtain a DNA sample from his daughter and sort of determine that this linkage, would connect to him, he was arrested, he was taken down, he was put in a car with Lieutenant Landwehr, and he looked at him and he said, why would you lie to me about the diskette? Why wouldn't you tell me the truth? You're a police officer. Again, it's an extraordinary mentality to think that, well, we were not trying to catch you, and so you're dealing with a piece of, he tells the police things like, I'm really a nice guy, I just feel mean sometimes, and just no recognition of the horror that he's created and the pain that he's caused for people for a generation and all of it. So I was just, it made a profound impression on me to watch this play out in this setting that I was pretty familiar with.
Now, this Pastor Clark, he continued a relationship with Dennis Rader when he was incarcerated. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, he believed that, that the law would handle Dennis Rader at the level of society, but that as his pastor, he had an obligation to, minister to this man and this man's soul. And when the rest of the world, including Rader's family, his wife, his two children, absolutely wanted nothing whatsoever to do with him, turned their back on him. Nobody wanted anything to do with this absolute pariah. Pastor Clark stood by him, and I thought it was, a very admirable thing for him to do, because he, like I said, he had gone through his terribly difficult times. He had come out the other side of it, and he wanted to help other people, and he said, this guy needs help. And, whether he helped him or not, who knows, but he didn't abandon him in his darkest hour. So if there's a hero in the book just for being, loving and having a heart and soul, I think it's Pastor Clark. And when you write a book like this, you want somebody to cheer for. You want some counterbalancing effect to all the evil that's spread.
Right. Let's talk just a little bit about the trial. I think it's a foregone conclusion if a person does an incredible confession, but that's not necessarily the truth. So maybe tell us a little bit about, was there an insanity plea?
No,
was that a realistic thing at all?
He wasn't tried. He didn't tell anybody what he was going to do on the day that the hearing was held to determine, what in fact, was he going to plead guilty? Was he going to plead innocent? What was he going to do? He didn't tell his lawyers. He didn't tell anybody. He didn't tell his minister. So this was late June of 2005, about 4 months after the arrest. He'd had 4 months to think about it. And he stood up in the courtroom and he said, I'm guilty of everything. And it could have been over in about, 5 minutes, because that's all that he needed to say. But the judge drew him out, which I thought was a very interesting development in the case, because it was like this entire city had been traumatized by him, and they needed some sort of public purging, some sort of public event to sort of leach this out of their system. And I think the judge believed that, and so he drew him out, and Rader stood there for, I don't know how long, an hour or so, and went through the crimes and gave the details over again as he had to the police. And at that point, there was no trial. It was just a matter of sentencing him. So that was late June, and then in mid-August, they held a sentencing hearing, and that's when the prosecutors sort of got their chance to have their say. And they brought out all these extraordinary photographs of him and all these images that none of us had ever seen. And some people thought it was excessive, but I think that somehow, society needs to get this out in the open and sort of let it out and it sort of demystify who BTK was. And you saw him as just this really sort of pathetic human being that had his own struggles and his own pain. And I think in the long run it was good. It was a good thing to do. It made you think about sexual repression. It made you think about, helping people with those issues, that those are very difficult issues for people to deal with sometimes. And I just think it had some benefits.
Now, during this hearing, you say they avoided the trial, and,
Yeah.
and that would have been much more painful for the victims to go through
Well,
that.
the family, his wife had gotten word to him and others and said, please, do not put our family or anybody, our church, through a long, drawn-out trial. So that probably weighed on him, too.
Right. And did you speak to any of the families or the victims' families yourself, any members of those families?
I spoke briefly to some of them, but they had told their stories so many times. I'd seen them interviewed so many times. One in particular, Jeff Davis, was the son of the last known victim of BTK from 1991. And he just done incredible things to Jeff's mother, and the murder had caused Jeff, to go into a severe depression and, really created a lot of grief for him. So he kind of became the public spokesman for the victims, and he really blasted BTK in the courtroom that last day. He had a chance to speak, and again, I thought it was, it's strange how these rituals, play out down through history, and that we need some sort of, public statement about what evil is and, what it does to people. And he kind of took on that role and really, really let him have it. Everybody else was trying to be polite, but he wasn't, and I think that was good.
Now, where is BTK right now?
He was, there's a maximum security prison for the most notorious criminals in Kansas, about 20 miles north of Wichita, called El Dorado. And he's in the El Dorado Correctional Facility. He will die there. He got 175 years, minimum, but I mean, he will die in prison. And so, again, to sort of recap, if you stop and think about it, here's a man who had gotten away with absolutely everything. He could have gone into retirement, enjoyed his children, his grandchildren, his wife, his dog. He had a dog that he loved, and he could not do that. He decided to play this cat and mouse game with the police, and now he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. So, it's an incredible story of the criminal mind and the criminal personality.
From your perception, from everything you've seen by covering this entire thing, do you think Dennis Rader is really angry about the way things have happened, or in his own twisted narcissistic mind, in the end it's still good that he's famous, that people have written about him, that he had that bond with police? What is your overall feeling about Dennis Rader? Is it regret, or did he enjoy talking about the details of those murders? Did he enjoy his moment in the sun?
That is a really difficult question. His behavior in the courtroom was absolutely unlike anything I've seen, and I think most veterans in that realm have ever seen. After those photos were presented the last day, after the victims' families got up and blasted him, he stood up and he began thanking all of the people that he'd been involved with since his arrest, the police, the people in the jail. It was compared to the Academy Awards.
Well, I was going to say
we just had in the United States. He seemed to be enjoying it. On the one hand, the attention, and on the other hand, he seemed to, here's again the great irony, that here's the man who hid his life from everything and everybody, and suddenly, it's being broadcast around the world, essentially, these incredible pictures, and it all came out. He couldn't hide it. He couldn't repress it. The thing that you look for, that I look for in a situation like this, is any sense of any self-awareness at all, any comment, anything about who he really was, or any self-insight. I mean, I never saw anything like it at all. It was like this dead person who could not feel anything, any of the results of his actions. I mean, he said, "I'm sorry," and all the right things, but no human connection there. And he had it for his family, he had it for his children, but it wasn't there in these other situations, and that's the part of it that's so hard to understand. If he had been an obvious psychopath, he would have stood out in the community, but he blended in perfectly. So it's a series of enigmas and just mind-boggling realities. I've always found nonfiction to be more incredible than fiction for myself. Because if I were trying to write something like this and make it up, I couldn't begin to do it.
Well, what I find in dealing with this for the last few years myself is that people are truly horrified by true nonfiction rather than fiction. They enjoy fiction. They enjoy Hannibal Lecter, and they enjoy all the characters that are now serial killers. It's dominant. But if you actually want to go and talk briefly about the details of some of these serial killers' crimes or how their mindset works in this sexual, sadistic fantasies, people do not want to hear about that. It seems an odd mix that it's okay if it's fiction, but the nonfiction outweighs the fiction by a long shot these days, and people are truly do not want to hear those details, at least most people.
Well, again, I think it goes back to this notion that we protect ourselves in part by saying, we see things pretty clearly. That's what it jars and upsets. The lawyer, one of the appointed public defender lawyers for Rader, he had two of them after his arrest. She couldn't, she almost had a breakdown, just from being around him and talking to him, because he seemed on the surface in many ways so normal. He reminded her of certain people she knew, and he had certain tendencies that were like hers, and they had similar religious belief systems. And she couldn't put together the reality of what he'd done with the person she was sitting next to. That's the terrifying part of it. That we're such mysteries to ourselves, and we're capable of such incredibly horrific things, while being the president of the church.
And also, we're very, very capable of being sucked in and being vulnerable to these kinds of people. It is unnerving, really. Yeah,
it is. It's very unnerving, and he was probably the best example I've ever seen of this. So, the most extreme.
Absolutely. Now, you had mentioned that you are the author of a few more true crime books. Tell us how many books that you have written, and maybe give us some titles of the books, and how people may contact you if they're...
I've written 20 books, and about 10 of them are about pretty high-profile crimes. The website is StephenSingular.com. That's StephenSingular.com, and I can be contacted through there. All of the books are listed on there. My first book was called Talk to Death, about the neo-Nazi murder of talk show host Alan Berg in Denver. It became the basis of the Oliver Stone 1989 movie Talk Radio.
Right.
That was a pretty significant case. I've written books about the O.J. Simpson case, a book called Legacy of Deception, which is kind of a very different take on that particular case. I wrote a book on the John Benet Ramsey case here in Colorado called Presumed Innocent or Presumed Guilty. I wrote a book about Mormon fundamentalist Warren Jeffs called When Men Become Gods. It came out in 2008. It's about Jeffs and sort of his running of the fundamentalist Mormons down in Arizona and Utah. And I've just completed a book on the murder of abortion doctor George Tiller in Wichita, another crime set in Wichita. And that book should be out later this year. It's a fascinating, story of the man who killed Dr. Tiller and the religion and politics around that. So.
Well, you're very prolific, Steve.
Well, I've been busy for the last 25 years or so.
Yes, absolutely.
So when I say that BTK is, the most unusual creature probably I've ever encountered, I have a pretty good frame of reference for those types of characters.
Absolutely. It's one of the most incredible ones that I've ever read about, and I've read a lot of those. So, we just got about 20 seconds. I just want to wrap up, and I want to thank you very much, Steve, for a fascinating program and to explain your incredible book. I just want to tell people it's Unholy Messenger, The Life and Crimes of the BTK Serial Killer. Thank you very much, Stephen Singular.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have yourself a very good evening.
You too, Dan.
Thank you. Good night. You're listening to a program, The Most Shocking Killers in True Crime History, and the authors that have written about them, with your host, Dan Sapansky. Good evening.